right, I'd like to welcome everyone to our afternoon In Conversation session, and we're going to be picking up on some themes that we talked about earlier in the day today, especially in John Crosby's keynote lecture this morning. And our discussion this afternoon is on structures of sin and co-responsibility and other related topics. And we're going to hear first from Derek Jeffries and then from John Crosby. I may say a little bit after that, and then we'll open it up for conversation.
Very good. Good afternoon. As Professor Spencer said, we're going to be picking up on a few of the topics of this morning, some continuity between topics. And I'm going to be briefly talking about this concept of structures of sin. The way I'm going to do this is to take you back to the 1980s, so 1984 to 1988. There's a very interesting moment in the papacy of John Paul II. He had a debate with liberation theology, which I'll talk about in a moment. And he also came out with a remarkable encyclical called Salvifici Dolores, which was mentioned this morning. And I'm going to suggest that there's a connection between these two documents. Then I'm going to end by stepping back and asking, well, what can we learn about this debate that occurred in the 1980s about structures of sin, some a bit of more specific things that I think that we can learn. So let's go back to 1984 to 1986. John Paul II became Pope in 1979. And this, for me, is a very rich period, really, from 80 to 90 in his thought. He came out with a lot of interesting encyclicals. And in 1984, I had this included in your reader, we saw the first document by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger in response to liberation theology. And then we saw another one in 1986. Some people think that that's a better one than the 84 one. I think it's a richer engagement with the topic. For those of you who don't know, liberation theology was a theological movement that came out primarily, not exclusively, but primarily from Latin and South America. And it focused, rightfully in my mind, on the scandal of poverty and just how awful poverty is in developing nations, but also in developed nations as well. And it continually pointed out the biblical witness about poverty. There's a lot of sections in the Bible about poor people and helping the poor. But the movement also came up with this concept of structures of sin. And it's sort of what we were trying to get at this morning. Is there a level at which an institution begins to take on a certain kind of unity or a certain kind of form, which is not independent of the persons, but has its own character? And the liberation theologians insisted that that's indeed the case, that there are structures that exhibit sinful practices, attitudes, policies, people for that matter. And so they spent a great deal of time talking about this concept of structures of sin, particularly in relation to the economics of South and Latin America. Now, the two interventions, didn't really deny those two contributions. There was a term called the preferential option for the poor, which John Paul II does affirm in one of his encyclicals. So they didn't really deny that that should be the central issue here about the scandal of poverty. And Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger and John Paul II also felt that there was something to this issue of structures of sin. But their criticisms was about institutional analysis. One of the things that I've spent a lot of my career on is trying to figure out, well, you have these institutions and you have personalism and sort of how do these things kind of fit together, these complex modern bureaucracies and modern institutions. And what the liberation theologians did is turn to the Marxist tradition, and they said that is the key to understanding these kinds of institutions. And the Vatican said that was a mistake, that we have to be very careful about what kind of tools, conceptual tools, that we embrace when we're thinking about institutions. But there was also another worry, which is that in all this talk about structures of sin, the person becomes effaced, the person kind of disappears. And And so there was a lot of controversy about this, back and forth, and theologians going to the Vatican and Boff and some other Gutierrez, people like that, in this kind of dispute. Now, what's very interesting to me, having studied John Paul II's thought for a very long time, my first book was on his views of international politics. It's very interesting to me is that around the same time you get this document called Salvifici Doloris. And it is an absolutely remarkable treatment of suffering. We talked this morning about suffering and bearing suffering, and Professor Frederica actually quoted from Salvifici Doloris. That's a text that I really like a lot, that particular text that she quoted. And so this is a beautiful treatment of suffering, but I think you also get a greater sense of the concept of being a person. And I included in your reading packets a selection from Salvifici Doloris, and it's a treatment of the parable of the Good Samaritan. John Paul II did a lot of interesting things with biblical texts, the rich young man, these kinds of texts. So he does a very intriguing analysis of the parable of the Good Samaritan. And what does he say? He says, well, when somebody is suffering, you need to be present to them, but in both a spiritual way and also a material way. So there's a recognition that just being present to somebody is important, but there's also some material realities that we need to help the poor. We can't just say, well, I'm with you, I have compassion or pity, that's very important, but we need to think about how we're going to actually help people who are in poverty. But there's a very interesting moment in that section that I selected for all of you. He uses this term availability, and I can't prove that he's drawing from someone named Gabriel Marcel, but it's a very similar concept. Availabilities, creative fidelity, these different words that Marcel uses. It's a beautiful idea from really a great thinker, not always easy to read. I mean, he's deliberately non-systematic, quotes a lot from his plays, kind of irritating, but he's a very rich mind. And availability is this presence to another person. And tomorrow I'm going to give a little bit more detail about this when I discuss my own involvement with prison lay ministry. What exactly does that mean, to be present to another? This morning we had some good questions about, well, what does this concretely mean when you're dealing with somebody who is in despair or dying or something like that? And there's a lot to say on that topic, but I just wanted to point out this strange term that all of a sudden crops up. And John Paul II, as I'm sure most of you know, was deeply philosophically trained, worked on Max Scheler, worked on so many of the thinkers that people are interested here in the foundation. So you get that understanding. So it's very clear that liberation theology made a mistake. When you engage institutions, you have to think about, well, what kind of tools are you going to use? And the Vatican felt that there was a problem with the selection of texts. So I put these two together just for your interest, these documents on liberation theology and this discussion of suffering in Salvifici Doloris. Now, what can we gain from this? I don't want to speak too long. I want to have a conversation. What can we take away from that? First of all, we need institutional analysis, and that means really getting to know institutions. As I said, I've spent time thinking about this in terms of the military, our prison system, but whatever you do, if you're involved in hospitals or hospice or anything like the homeless, anything like that, you have to know what's going on institutionally. And too many philosophers and too many people in ethics make a lot of statements about these institutions that don't really know what's going on. You really have to spend time in the institution and kind of grow with that and figure out what is happening. So that's my first conclusion from these documents, that the liberation theologians were correct, in my view, in that kind of focus. They were incorrect in the kind of conceptual apparatus that they endorsed. So you want to think about, I'm going to pick this social scientific theory, for example, behaviorism, let's say, in the context of prisons. I've reviewed some books where people take B.F. Skinner or somebody like that. And you have to say, is this really a good tool? Is this in keeping with my philosophical commitment to the person, the dignity of the person, the value of the person? And if it's not, it doesn't mean you can't use it at all. but maybe not. Maybe you're going to say this is just not something that helps illuminate the institution, okay? And the last thing I would say is don't ever forget the person, the kind of work that's done here in the Hildebrand Project, the essential characteristics of a person. I'm going to come back to this tomorrow, but the person as an embodied spirit, capable of free choice and love and will and knowledge, the deep sense of what it means to be a person, because this is really important today. People have often forgotten that. So those are three, I hope to get even more concrete tomorrow, but these are three things I think that we can take away from looking at these documents and thinking about the structures of sin. So I'm going to turn to my colleague, Professor Crosby, and if he wishes to make comments or responses.
Good. Thank you, Derek. I think I'll offer a little response simply in the way of how I came personally to the issue of structures of sin and how I came to acknowledge that there really is such a thing and how it has to be inserted within the whole of Catholic teaching. It was back at the time of the murder of George Floyd and a number of other black people, and a lot was said about the fact that this shows that there is systemic racism in our society. Some affirmed this systemic racism and saw it being exemplified in the way these murder cases were handled, and others denied it and said this is a fiction of the sociologists. There is no such thing. That the only real sin is individual personal sin. To try to have sinful structures is, well, it's an offense against personalism. It's looking for sin in an objective place, whereas it's the human heart and conscience that is the real locus of sin. So I was driven back to do some soul searching about my own upbringing. I grew up in Mobile, Alabama in the 50s and 60s, and there was undeniably a great deal of racism that I took for granted, and I revisited all of that, and I came to the conclusion that yes, there is such a thing as a social structure of sin, a kind of objectivized evil that's not simply identical with the malice of a particular racist individual. But let me give you an example of what I began to recognize as a kind of systemic racism. Growing up, I had a lot of contact with black people, but there were certain features about the situation and the life of these people that I just took for granted without putting it into question. So they all lived in very poor neighborhoods. Hardly any of them had a car. They attended segregated schools. Most of them didn't finish grammar school. And none of this seemed unusual to me or strange. I just took it for granted. And what, on reflection, comes to me is that I didn't discover that I had wicked malice in my heart towards the blacks of Mobile, Alabama. It was a kind of, as I say, thoughtless taking for granted. The fact that they were all on the periphery, these blacks, that they were all in subservient position to white employers, didn't trouble me. It didn't seem strange. It just seemed the natural way things are. And that appearance of naturalness, of what is in fact quite disordered, is, I would take it, a kind of systemic racism. Racism not just in the human heart, but in presuppositions that we make, ways of perceiving the world. mother had a lot of dealings with black women who helped in the house, and she too made all of these racist assumptions, but without the least bit of malice. Whenever one of the black people were sick or in need, she was the first to take care and provide things and help that they otherwise didn't have access to. So it's this peculiar situation of social structures that embody something fundamentally false, and which are taken for granted without any great inner malice. That's there are other specimens of this. Let me another specimen of this systemic racism. There are many places in the southern states where slaves were auctioned off. These are places of unimaginable grief, for it was here that families were broken up, that mothers saw their children for the last time, children saw their mother for the last time. But very few of these slave markets are memorialized. All across the southern states, there are statues commemorating the Confederate generals like Jefferson Davis, but very few memorials of the terrible human suffering inflicted at the slave markets. President Obama once spoke at one of these slave markets and noticed that there was a memorial plaque commemorating an insignificant speech that Andrew Jackson had given there, but no memorial plaque for the thousands of slaves who had passed through, no remembrance of their names or of their final place. So, so in this way, this is my way of coming at the social structures of sin, and I do want to affirm that, of course, these are not like independent powers, these social structures that we have no power over. They arise, according to universal Catholic teaching, from the perversity of the human heart. They perdure through the blindness, the self-interested blindness of the heart. And they can be dismantled and removed by the energetic stirring of consciences. So I don't at all think of these structures of sin as something that constrains our freedom, as some disorder that's completely beyond the reach of our free choice. But yet there is something there, a curious objectivity, some kind of detachment from the heart and the conscience that leads me to embrace, for my own part, the idea of systemic racism. Yeah, and maybe I'll just add this as one final thought. Not many years ago, the white mayor of New Orleans, began to think that there was something wrong about all the Confederate statues in New Orleans. He realized that they were put up at the end of the 19th century to send a message to the black population of New Orleans. The message was something like this: we may have lost the Civil War, but we are now the ones in charge here in New Orleans, which is a white city for white people. A message of white supremacy. So the mayor realized that this was humiliating for the black men and women of the city. And he said very rightly that the Confederate generals had fought a war to deny the humanity of black people. How is it right to ask black men and women of today to honor such men and live in the shadow of their statues? So he took the matter to his city council, and amazingly enough, by a vote of 6-1, his city council voted to take all these Confederate generals down, take their statues down. And was some protest, but no real violence or bloodshed, and it was an act of dismantling a certain social structure, a certain wrong message, a certain objectified denigration of the black population. Here was a case where one intervened, acted to undo it. So, confirming the fact that this is something accessible to our freedom, despite a curious kind of detachment from our freedom. So, yeah, that's all I would contribute by way of an example. You were talking about Latin America and Marxist influence. This is very different, but it's the same phenomenon, I think.
Yes.
So I think we can concur in evaluating it like that.
Well, I don't want to say too much because I think we'll open this up for questions, but first of all, thank you for your story. I entirely affirm what you've said. And I think that all of you can reflect on this given different kinds of institutions, as I said. I'm going to just give you one example, and then I think we can have questions and answers. The prison where I volunteer is a maximum security prison in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And this place is 126 years old, and it looks like an old prison. The walls were built originally by young men in the early part of the 20th century, and it's a scary place. First time I went there, it was a scary place. And it holds about 1,000 to 1,100 men. Many of them, it's a maximum security prison, and many of them have done really terrible deeds. And people just drive past this. It's right off the highway. They don't know anything about it. They don't know who's in there. It used to be called a reformatory, which was a movement to deal with the population of 17-year-olds to 25-year-olds, which is a troublesome part of some people's lives. It hasn't been a reformatory in decades. It's a maximum security prison for adult men. But you get people, the reformatory or women there. They don't just ask any questions. They just drive past and don't think about. We had a lot of horrors post-COVID, a lot of horrors in this place. And I think this is what Professor Crosby is talking about, a strange kind of detachment. And the place has its own unity of some kind, and I think we can debate exactly ontologically what that is and things like that. But the phenomena is very real, that these places and these institutions take on a certain aspect. I mean, sometimes it feels like the walls. You walk into this place and the walls, that a lot of suffering of these young men, and this might sound like Dostoevsky and mysticism or something like that, but there's real suffering in this place and decades of suffering. So I thought your comments were very apropos, John, and I think that they're really food for thought and important.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to both of you. And I think there are some microphones. If people put their hands up, we can start having a conversation. I'm going to start it off with a question to all of you. To just sort of, I know you're going to talk about this tomorrow, Derek, practical things that we can do, but I'd like to sort of get the ball rolling on that. If both of you could say some things about sort of practically how we can work to dismantle these structures of sin. We all find ourselves as parts of them, not just racist structures of sin, but structures of sin involving economic injustice towards the poor and economic injustice in other ways, environmental injustice. And it's very easy for us to just sort of be part of those, right? Like, I mean, I shop at Amazon all the time, and Amazon exploits its workers terribly. But I continue to shop at Amazon. So we've heard a lot about how you can sort of practically live out community on a small scale. It seems here there are things we can do in a sort of interpersonal way, as you're doing in prisons and jails. But what can we, if we're trying to live personalistically, do to influence the dismantling of these structures of sin on a large scale, sort of on a level of national policy?
Yeah.
Are there things we can do there?
Well, there is always a relationship between the personal and the institutional. So I resist saying, well, it's only structures of sin or systemic racism or something like that without the personal side. And it's not enough just to say, well, I'm going to do things interpersonally and pay no attention to the institutional realities. So that's the starting point. There has to be that dialogue between the two. But this means really getting to know what some of the, not become a policymaker. I'm not a a prison warden. I taught the police department of Green Bay once ethics and learned a lot about them, but I'm not a police officer, and so you have to be very cautious about how much you actually do know and don't know, but you need to get involved in those details. And I wrote a lot about solitary confinement, where I did try to, and there have been movements to try to eliminate that. The state of New York just got rid of solitary confinement entirely. Wisconsin, we just don't seem to want to do anything, I'm afraid. But so you can't lose hope of trying to make those institutional changes. That relationship between those two is pretty central to me.
Thank you. John, do you have any?
Yeah. Well, I would think we could all somehow resolve to be a little more self-critical, and maybe test a little more critically the mores and the patterns of behavior and the expectations and the stratification of our social life, and try to bring to light. I mean, as soon as we're conscious of it, we've already made a tremendous step forward. So to burst the bubble of this appearance of naturalness in what is really highly disordered, that's a step forward. And then, the New Orleans mayor shows a very concrete project that intervened and reshaped the face of the city of New Orleans and, struck a blow at certain structures of sin.
Yeah.
I think we have a question over here.
Yeah, thank you so much for both of your comments, first of all. I couldn't help but think about Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility as both of you were speaking, particularly as it relates to kind of like communal guilt. And in that book, she defines racism as something that's inhabited by white people than a direct discrimination, and calls white persons to kind of reframe how they understand racism as something like they inherently inhabit, regardless of their decisions. And I'm just curious if you guys think that is a good thing for us to move towards, or if there's a better way to approach it than her proposal.
I unfortunately don't know that book. Do you?
I do.
White Fragility, you may have an answer.
I don't really recommend that text. I think there's some difficulties, without getting into the weeds of the argument. I think there's some difficulties in her presentation. It became very popular after the George Floyd incident. I mean, in general, I take the position that we've described here, but I think she makes a lot of assumptions and mistakes, and I know this has become the basis for important dialogue. I don't disagree with that at all, but it's not a work, JP, that I really would highly recommend. She doesn't have historical knowledge of racism, and she does not have sociological knowledge or a lot of other things. So I don't mean to burst your bubble if you like the book, but it's not a text that I would recommend.
Is there something you would recommend that is good on this?
Well, there are many books that I would recommend on. Yeah. There's a lot of worthwhile texts on race and racism, and but that's a movement that Kindy is another one at Boston University. I think both of them kind of missed the mark. They became very popular, but I think they kind of missed the mark. Yeah. And so, unfortunately, sometimes people. My sons call these people grifters. I don't mean to be, but grifters. Yes, and I don't want to go that far, but I don't think that they helped as much as they should have. So there are lots of texts dealing with different aspects of racism and the history of racism that one can explore, other than that particular one.
Amanda?
First, just to John Paul's question, I think it's interesting, and we've got to be wary of whenever the account for social evils would leave no capacity for reconciliation or restoration. So anything that would lock us into an entrenched paradigm. So I don't know if it does that, but there has to always be open the capacity for people to turn around and act morally. Yeah. And so against a kind of determinism there. But I wanted to pick up, Mark, on your question, which is quite similar to what I was left with at the end of your excellent remarks, and that is the concrete dismantling of these structures of sin and how we can best discern the personalist and humanizing antidote, given that probably there are also ways in which persons of goodwill would disagree about what that concrete antidote looks like. So, for example, on the one hand, you could have the highlighting of ethical exemplars from the marginalized community. And you could have the highlighting of ethical exemplars who dissented from the conventions of their society and acted rightly. Those are different approaches, and do you include both and a whole wider plurality, or make a choice in favor of one or the other? And then what is the didactic power of that? And then just one other issue in the mix, I'm thinking a lot of the Rupnik scandal. So for those who are not familiar, there's a priest who was a serial abuser and designed many mosaics that are throughout Catholic churches around the world. And it's been a big decision point for the church about, particularly the churches that have these mosaics, what to do with this art. Do you destroy the art? Do you cover the art? Do you have a plaque indicating and acknowledging the abuse? Recently, one church said, we're going to have a prayer of the faithful for victims of abuse. So again, there's all these different contours, and I think it's just interesting to consider, like, what is the positive content we're imbuing? Because we have so much of a culture that would say, dismantle the structures of sin, tear down the injustice, which is a first step. But if we don't have a positive moral content to replace it that's didactic and exemplary, we could be just as adrift afterwards.
Well, I do agree, Amanda. I've only met you yesterday. But you seem to have a good mixture here because you do a lot of different talks about euthanasia in Canada. But you also told me that you're involved in some parliamentary activities, and that's a good example of how to bring together these two sides. And I certainly agree with you that just tearing something down without any kind of alternatives or any. In the prison world, you have some people who call themselves prison abolitionists, and they have taught me a lot, although myself am not an abolitionist, but some of them simply want to dismantle. We have a terrible carceral system, I mean, just extraordinarily bad, and the temptation is to say, crush it. That sometimes can lead to worse problems. So I take your points, and each kind of activity, you have to think very carefully about that mixture of the personal and the institutional and how to affect that kind of change. It'll be different in the business world, it'll be different in the medical world. In your case, it has to do with controversy about euthanasia. So yeah, think very hard about that relationship. So very good, it's good comments.
Can I just insert quickly? Lou, thank you. Just before we move on, because maybe, Charles, you'll have a different direction, but the mention of the Rupnik mosaics, I think they're in several hundred churches. I mean, it's particularly egregious because he abused also religious sisters, and sometimes it seems to have been sort of part of the art-making process. So I don't have a solution to that. But it did remind me of the fact that a certain radical approach to all of Western art could be viewed as sort of expressions of structures of sin, because so many aristocratic households, for example, which were the patrons, had their wealth by extortion. Then during the colonial period, much of this comes from the backs of slaves. So are we going to write off the Baroque in the name of structures of sin? I know that's not what you're suggesting, but just to show how difficult these issues get very quickly.
No,
I would be very interested in what you know. What you have to say, there are some people out there who want us to sort of abandon our Western canon, not because they disagree with it, but because they think it's somehow poisoned through the
Yeah, I don't think that's the case. We all have to live with the legacy of sin. We have to live with our own sin. I mean, who knows what people are going to think about us in 100 years if we have any kind of documents and beauty to offer them. So I don't take that approach to the past, but you need to name it. You need to say that this is part of the creation. The strange fact that there could be horrible people, Caravaggio or someone like that, who have this beautiful art. But no, the answer is not to just simply efface it. But in the particular context, the issue of the statues, I think that was a very positive move. You don't have to destroy them. You can move them to a museum or something like that. In certain concrete cases, and this particular case that you're talking about, I haven't looked at all the details about how many churches this would be, but it would be pretty awful if I were victimized by a priest to walk in and see that mosaic. So again, this is very contextual at a certain level. We don't want a blanket approach and say, people like Heidegger, things get a little complicated, but sometimes that enters into the work. But simply saying, well, you were an awful person and therefore I'm going to police your art and get rid of you is a terrible approach.
Yeah, no. No, I think it's an excellent idea, Amanda, this idea of holding up exemplary persons from the subjugated race or from the subjugating race who had the selflessness to see through the structures of sin, I think.
So we're oriented somewhere.
Yeah,
Yep.
right. I think that the power of those exemplary persons shouldn't be underestimated, and it's just the kind of alternative to this destructive approach that you and John Henry have mentioned. Yeah.
Charles?
Thank you. I'll just address my comments to both of you. I'm wondering, I think it was, I can't remember which one was saying that these structures of sin arise from human perversity. They can be dismantled. They're not independent powers, but they're objective in some way. Can that be a little bit elaborated on? And would that at all relate to what Paul writes in several places about the principalities and powers, that our battle is not just against flesh and blood, but principalities and powers that do seem to be objective and stand over against us, and it's not just the result of individual will, but something maybe greater. And then the other, another wonderment is, what would you think as a legitimate tool to analyze structures of sin? Critical theory. And it's very debatable as actually what critical theory is. And then just a comment. Exemplars, I'm thinking of communities that can be exemplars. So I'm going to go back to the local. So one of the reasons, what we practice in our community, we do not have private property for a reason. It's not just to help us not to fall into greed, but it's a declaration against a fallen system that depends on private property that gives rise to injustice. And so it's structured into embedded into the way we are. We want to live justly and do so in a structural way, among others. So could that not be one way to dismantle from below rather than from above?
Do you want me to take the first two?
Yeah, certainly the witness of the Bruderhof and your shared life together and the renunciation of the private property that certainly can contribute to this elevation of consciousness, whereby we begin to see through the structures of sin instead of just blindly accept them. I think that witness of such a community, just like the witness of great individuals, is surely an important part of the process.
Well, let me address two of your questions rather than the third one. I think we can do an ontology of these kinds of strange unities. I know you went to Buffalo and you had a professor up there called Barry Smith who did an ontology of just about everything, and it got a little strange and weird. But I think you can really reflect on the meaning of these. We've been having a discussion about quasi-substances or parts or things like that. But I think you can really recognize that there is, as Professor Crosby said, some kind of, objective-subjective is a very complex topic in epistemology, but there's something standing over against us that has the qualities that Professor Crosby mentioned. So I think we could do that, and if anybody wants to talk about that, the character of substance, quasi-substance, all those things. On your second question, you have to tell me what you mean by critical theory. I mean, who do you have in mind? Some of it, frankly, I would not recommend at all. But I have found in my own work that Michel Foucault is a very problematic, philosophically, very problematic, historically. I mean, he just gets a lot of this history wrong. But he's almost inescapable because he raised some questions that I ignored him as a graduate student, and then those, all the stuff coming from France. I thought this is just. But when I started working in prisons, I thought, well, the guy does have a couple of insights So you can reject his overall philosophical vision, which I think is destructive and false, frankly. Also, as an historian, you can say, the guy just got that selection I gave you from about madness, that scholar is very much opposed to Foucault from an historical standpoint, not a philosophical standpoint. So you'd have to tell me what you mean by critical theory. Some of it might be helpful. My own view is a lot of it isn't. But I had a conversation with somebody here about theory, and some younger people were telling me about what's going on with theory at Yale and places like that, and I was hoping it would kind of go away, but apparently it's still around. So the third one, I don't have a detailed response, Charles, but thank you for those questions.
I would also just, if I could jump in on that as well, I mean, I think in Hildebrand and in the realist personalist phenomenologists, we find some tools for analysis in this idea that's come up a couple of times and that Maria's going to talk about tomorrow of the unitive power of value. Yeah. If we think of disvalue, right, so values are things like justice and beauty and courage and intellectual genius and these sorts of ways in which things show up as important. If we think of disvalue as the polar opposite of those, you can get a sort of perverse unity that comes about through people coming together around these disvalues, around various sorts of injustice, as in the case of slavery. And there's a kind of external force, in a sense, which maybe theologically we would want to understand in terms of the demonic, but even sort of phenomenologically, we can just see how disvalue has this sort of magnetic or gravitational power to pull people together into these structures of sin.
I think we're going to hear more about this, I suppose, tomorrow about the virtus unitiva, which is a very interesting concept of where the values bring together people, as you said, can be shown in relation to the disvalues. So I think that's an excellent point.
Yeah. So we'll continue talking about that as we go forward here. Someone over here?
Yes.
Sorry, John.
I have a question for Professor Jeffries. I was quite interested in your experience and comments about the prison system and how awful it was, especially since there were actual people in the prison who were treated not very much like people. And it has been said a couple of times already that we are the image of God, but we of course were made in the image of God. Since then we've fallen. Myself, I've fallen quite away. But a question that might be very much at the root of the whole prison system: does human dignity increase and decrease to the extent that a person participates in virtue in God?
Yeah, this would be a big discussion. I think there are different kinds of dignity, what we call inherent dignity that does not at all change, and that is what is being violated in my view. But there's also other kinds of dignity. Our colleague, Professor Seifert, describes a kind of acquired dignity that comes in degrees. And so we have to decide, first of all, the meaning of the term dignity. Professor Crosby has written very insightfully about this topic. But in terms of inherent dignity, it is my own view that our prison system profoundly violates inherent dignity, almost effaces it in our solitary confinement regime. So I hope that helps. Perhaps we can talk a bit more about the concept of dignity. I've written about it, and I thought I was going to get away from it, and I'm afraid I'm still stuck.
You wrote a book with that title, didn't you?
I've written several books on that topic, exactly. And I thought I was done with that, but here it is. Pardon? No, that was a good question. That was an excellent question. So.
Yeah. No.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you both for your talks. I had a question kind of building on Amanda's point about orienting ourselves within these concepts, like how to approach them. Thinking about the fact that Dr. Crosby, your talk on shared responsibility and this idea of structures of sin, it can be very paralyzing, actually, because I think with media, I feel that all the injustices of the world, whether it's war or child slavery, we could go on and on and on. There seems to be endless things to feel terrible about. And so I guess my question is maybe one of prudence, or how to think about where, so if we have responsibility, where and how to meet that responsibility. Does that have something to do with proximity? Locality, like starting where you're at geographically, or I don't know, but I think that oftentimes the problem that this can lead to is an overwhelm that leads to non-action. Yeah. So I just was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah. Well, in a way, one of the points I was trying to make this morning was that this idea of co-responsibility is encouraging when we feel that evil is too great and we can't make a dent against it. The idea that all the good we do has this resonance in the moral universe and bears fruit that we won't see. So that's an encouraging thought, that we don't just fight evil head on directly and maybe get destroyed in the process, but we can also fight it by somehow harnessing this mysterious moral energy of diffusion that comes from the solidarity and the co-responsibility. So somehow where we seemed powerless, well, we're after all not so powerless if this is true, that we have this co-responsibility and the good we do can redound to the blessing of people who we'll never meet and never see. So I understand that natural feeling of overwhelm, problems too big for me to touch. I throw up my hands in despair, but on closer reflection, there's something there that can encourage us to think of ourselves as real agents in the struggle between good and evil, just thanks to this dimension of co-responsibility.
Yeah, I share Professor Crosby's point entirely, as I did some of his earlier points. But I also see what you're saying, Renee, is that sometimes these problems seem absolutely overwhelming. Sometimes you're just disappointed. I've written some books with the hope that there would be some kind of change in certain areas. It just didn't come. And so one confronts a kind of danger of despair. Despair is that there's nothing I can do. I'm going to stop doing that. But I am encouraged. Sometimes you see small changes. Those are really important. As I mentioned, New York State got rid of the solitary confinement system. We have not, but somehow that's a really positive thing. As far as picking the area, sometimes it's that kind of choice. Sometimes the choice comes to you. And it's not physical proximity. It's, in my case, many years ago, it came to me through the prison system. And I don't, a lot of that wasn't my own choice. Confluence of all kinds of events. If you're interested in Providence, then you can begin that kind of talk as well. So I wouldn't say, well, I'm hopeless, there's so many problems, and what, begin to think about your own story, your own life, and what is central to you, and how you can begin to undertake a response to that, the kind of injustice. Perhaps it's inadequate, but.
Well, before I hand it to you, Amanda, two things. I'm reminded of, there's a final interview of Hans Urs von Balthasar, which you can see online. It's in German, but there are subtitles. And it's sort of about the last question that's asked is sort of, what is your ultimate commitment or conviction? And it's interesting because he would have had many deeply theological things to say, but he says that ultimately I believe that human destiny passes through the freedom of each individual person, which is a striking sort of reflection back on his life. And in fact, he then tells the story of Maximus the Confessor, through whom Orthodox Christian doctrine passed really, in one sense, through him, because he was surrounded by opponents on all sides. So it's always struck me that, to your point, Renee, we can feel powerless, but in fact, there is a tremendous amount that rests with each of us. One thing I was just going to say, I sort of picked it up in the room a little bit, is there what do you make of the reaction from those of us who are not sort of steeped in critical theory, who feel that the systemic racism issue can be overstated? Is this just a lack of willingness to accept our solidarity with particularly our past, or do you think, Derek, in particular, that this is partially due to the fact that the critical race position is presented so aggressively, and as Amanda was saying before, we're just locked in and there's nothing we can do?
Yeah.
But I know that when we speak of people of goodwill, there are those who are generally a bit more hesitant to accept the structures of sin concept wholesale. They want maybe even more nuances than we've given. So I just wanted to sort of speak for that sensibility.
Yeah, I don't think it's overstated, and I think we often just have to listen to others and understand their own experiences. And as I said, I've tried to do this by, I trained the police force, 180 officers, and went forward to them and talked about dignity and heard their pushback, and I wanted to hear their position and see what they had to say. So I don't believe it's overstating. But the critical, again, what do we mean by critical theory? But I don't think that was the most helpful framework at all. I think in some ways it was very alienating. The George Floyd incident was so shocking, and it should have been, and it happens to a lot of people around the country. But it's still, I'm just not sure that was the best kind of apparatus. And this gets to my earlier point. What kind of apparatus do you reach for in order to understand the situation? And I would not have chosen that. So it's a very real problem. I try to be open to receive from other people and their own experiences, but be cautious about what kind of apparatus you choose.
If I could just jump back for a minute to the question of our Dutch friend on the dignity of persons, and if there's a dignity that's never lost. And it seems to me that we do have to say that even the worst criminal does not forfeit a certain basic human dignity. That's been disputed among Catholic theologians, and there are even texts in Aquinas where he seems to say that the criminal is like a beast and has lost his humanity, and other texts where he seems to say, no, the criminal still retains this fundamental human dignity. But I think that latter position is a position very important to maintain.
Entirely.
And then, of course, distinguishing that inalienable dignity from the other senses where dignity comes in degrees.
Couldn't agree with you more there, John. Absolutely.
Yeah, and if I could... go ahead.
Sinful structures. I think there is a response in the New Testament. So you have let's say the slavery is sinful structure, slavery. That was a very common thing in the Hellenistic civilization. What does St. Paul do with the slave? Mm-hmm. He sends him back to his master and was realizing with that he is undermining the system. He says, I give the slave back, but he is renewed, he's a new person. Yeah. And that doesn't seem to have any effect. But in the end, that would provoke the abolition of slavery in the Middle Ages. Yeah, sometimes I think we are impatient there, understandable also. Yeah, but it's quite a striking example. So Christianity didn't introduce I call it a revolution that cancels the structures, but it's going from the inside. Yeah. Maybe you can comment on that.
Well, thank you. That's a very helpful comment all by itself. Did you have more on that, Derek?
Yeah, I think we'd have to work on that a bit more because I do agree with you. You're referring to Philemon or that text in the New Testament, but the whole question of slavery in the Roman world and understanding what happened with the slavery, and I'm not sure that for us the best response is to simply make those kinds of moves. Those are very important. But we live in a different kind of world with institutions, and we have to do the kind of things that Professor Crosby mentioned, more public kinds of responses. So for me, that's just not going to be, it's important, it's necessary, as philosophers would say, a necessary but not sufficient approach to the problem.
We have further questions here. Yes, maybe.
They were just brief.
Oh.
Points. Do you want to go ahead first?
Thank you, Amanda. I've thought of a lot of these issues before, but never under the construct structures of sin. And that was really interesting to me because it helped me contextualize our discussion today about repentance. And I started thinking about how complicated the calculus is for repentance, especially with sins that seem to be transgenerational or things that last a lifetime. And for simple sins, like if I were to eat my little brother's peanut butter and jelly sandwich and he were to demand of me, I want your car now, I'd say, well, that's an unreasonable expectation of my penance, because I can kind of do a simple calculation of what's reasonable penance for me, not just at this time, but for this act. And I'm wondering if there is some sort of ethical framework that talks about how to calculate penance for things that are transgenerational or eternal, because at the time of confession, a priest knows that our sins are something that seem eternal. When we leave the confessional, there's still residue on our hearts, and yet, I don't have people throwing stones at me because I'm only saying an Our Father for something. There's kind of a permission of time, and I'm wondering what that looks like for issues like these, because I'm not sure that tearing down a mosaic or dismantling a statue seems like enough, but at the same time, there's also like a what can I do at this time? So is there, someone smart who came up with a calculus that makes that more simple?
If only.
I would resist the Gabriel Marcel distinguished between a problem and a mystery, and this kind of thing is not something we can have a solution to or a technical formula or anything like that. Doesn't mean we can't try to understand it and work on it. So I don't really have any kind of formula for doing that. You have to live it. I'm not a priest, so I can't examine, what happens in the confessional, but I think that would be a mistake to try to have some kind of calculus at all. It's just a wrong approach to the issue.
Yeah, it could be that the notion of incommensurability, which pops up in philosophy in different places, fits here too. That no reparation is enough for what happened at those slave markets and the destruction of families. There's no such thing as too much. It's all not enough. But so the reparation and the crime being restored are so incommensurable that it seems that a real convincing calculus isn't even available to us.
I agree with you. Yeah, very good. Yeah.
Would you say that in these cases, and maybe even in the case of our individual penances after we go to confession, I sometimes have this worry about, you say your sins and you say get 3 Hail Marys, sort of a tit for tat kind of thing, that maybe a kind of accounting calculus is not the right model.
Yeah.
In the case of reparations, say for slavery or the treatment of indigenous people, it seems like a real reparation would be the full integration of the two peoples into a common life, right? Where we no longer have the kinds of structures of sin and separation. Do you think that sort of model is the right kind of model in relation to those who have committed serious crimes or reparations cases, that's the sort of restorative model we ought to be looking to?
Yeah, I like the focus on restoration and doing something new as a response to the wrong inflicted on them.
I like the concept of incommensurability, because I think these are crimes that some crimes are just so awful that and you want to avoid what Professor Spencer just said, which Nietzsche calls the accountant's mentality. I'm going to add these things up. You just don't want to do that. But there is a practice called restorative justice, which I can talk to some of you about. I have participated in it, where one tries to restore the harm. And it's not just the offender who has harmed others, but the offender has a story about his harm, and people get in a room. It's extremely powerful. There was a 60 Minutes piece about 2 years ago that featured a gentleman that I went to church with, and it was immensely powerful dealing. He's never going to be released, so it's not a matter of him trying to get over on anybody, but he came to an understanding of the harm that he did, and he met with some relatives, and it was just rather overwhelming. So I would much favor those kinds of things rather than trying to figure out recompense and those matters.
Amanda, did you?
So quick roundup of reactions. First, to you, Mark. about what to make of these radically diverging views, though, about what constitutes even a movement toward restitution in the first place, or restoration. So, for example, with indigenous peoples, some might say that's not at all the goal, is an integration. That's actually the source of injustice from the start. And so it may be kind of challenging given radically diverging views of restoration. To Cedric's point, and we touched on it briefly, but I just wanted to mention another interesting personalist thinker, Robert Spemann. And he talks about these two kinds of dignity, at least two kinds of dignity. On the one hand, that inalienable, equal, common to all dignity that can't be lost, but he also talks about the additional dignity, obviously, from which we get the term that would be connected with the dignity connected to an office, like a king or something like this, and how that can be forfeited when people fail to meet the moral standards. I love this line where he says, "Starved in his bunker, Father Maximilian Kolbe had more dignity than the henchman who took his life. Yet he also had more dignity than the righteous man for whom he sacrificed his life." And that's because the heroism of holiness is the highest dignity to which human beings can aspire. So there's this whole moral gradation, not at the level of that fundamental ontological dignity, but at the level of moral dignity. So maybe actually in the document released by the Vatican recently called Dignitas Infinita, there's a distinction of ontological dignity on the one hand and moral dignity. There might even be 4 kinds of dignity in that document, if I remember. So that document would be a great sort of group project for the Hildebrand Project to unpack. And lastly, to Renee and Professor Crosby on the reacting to evil without a sense of just despair or malaise at the situation. I was recalling just really being struck by, after the deadliest attack on Jews in America with the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting in 2018, I remember seeing a lot of efforts on the part of Jewish groups who were saying, we've got to do 11 good deeds. We've got to sing 11 times louder. We have got to do 11 kind of charitable works here and there. And this was the kind of the touch point. The response was, for the 11 who we lost in this brutal, unjust way, we're going to react with 11 positive good deeds. So just to overwhelm evil with goodness. And I think that's a very positive, aspirational, but also manageable thing to do when you see something wrong and you decide, I'm going to cast more light into the world through my own effort to do good. And that can really prevent our own demoralization and debilitation in the face of moral evil.
Thank you.
I entirely agree with all that you say, Amanda.
Well, I've been taught by you, so.
I would say that the dignity issue, we could do an entire session on that, and all the comments you made were really quite good. But I wanted to respond to the first point you made, is that about indigenous peoples and assimilation and things like that. For me, that's an example of not listening to the people that you want to help, because perhaps immigration in this country was often a kind of an assimilationist project, and then people said, well, wait a minute now, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean that the white Protestant majority, that I'm supposed to become that? And so you need to listen to those groups and sit down with them and see. You don't have to agree with everything people say, but just sit down and say, well, what do you want, and what's important to your group? So I think that that's an important way of approaching this problem.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, again, here I think some of the things that Hildebrand says in the Metaphysics of Community on the unity of communities can be helpful here. Hildebrand has a great appreciation, and others in the realist, personalist, phenomenological movement have a great appreciation for the nation or the culture as a real unity, that there is a sort of unique value that each genuine nation instantiates and that needs to be preserved. And thinking about indigenous groups or immigrant groups or already established nations or what have you in those terms, I think can be quite helpful for thinking through how to relate in a non-sort of just dissolving, melting pot sort of assimilationist.
Mixed salad, as they've said, rather than, right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think like Amanda, I have all these like thoughts that I've been kind of storing up, but I think it's just the first thing I was thinking about was, like we keep on bringing up, just the futility of trying to make reparation because nothing we do can make up for it. And I guess I've been thinking about this since this morning when Maria was talking about like accompanying people in their suffering. I think the incarnation is the answer to like all of these problems, and how like our Father can't make up for my sins, but Jesus made up for my sins. And even just the idea of like, he acknowledged our suffering, he entered into it, and then he took it on for us. And so I guess what you were saying, Amanda, about Maximilian Kolbe's model of holiness, like he took on all of that. And I really feel like the only way to bring healing in all of these situations is for everyone to enter into the, communion of saints and receive healing from Christ. And so I think that all of our efforts are going to feel like they're not enough because they aren't. But if we like surrender them to God and, open ourselves to grace and the action of grace in that and pray for the people. And like, yeah, we should try to do actual things and not just sit and pray. But I just feel like, again, like, you do the little you can and then you just offer it to God to do the rest. But again, I feel like the incarnation is the answer to all of these.
Yeah, I think I might slightly disagree with that. And since I agree with what you've said about the importance of the incarnation, and we need to explore fully what that means. But as John Paul II says, sometimes there's a material reality here too, that there are poor people who need goods or something like that, or we can't have a prison system of over, at this point it's not 2 million, but it was a 2 million some years ago. There are just some things, we can't have slaves in our midst, things like that.
And I wasn't saying that we shouldn't not do stuff. I was just saying, like, when you feel helpless and hopeless,
Yes,
like,
I got it.
Go to that image. And then actually, I was thinking of another thing. One more thought I meant to bring up was,
Please.
it's like, we're like talking about what do we do with these mosaics or these, buildings that were built by enslaved people. And I was just thinking about how, again, in the incarnation, Christ took this instrument of torture, and it's this symbol of salvation. And like, so everything that is created through human suffering, in a sense, is redeemed because of the way he redeemed us through the cross. And we can see all these things as crosses for these people.
Agree with you there again. I wrote a book about torture, though, and sometimes we have to say, stop torturing people, the government.
Yeah, I don't want torture to continue.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
I mean, sometimes we have to oppose.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there is hope in all of these, that God has an answer in all of these. And so I'm not dismissing the suffering at all. I'm saying we can be entered into our suffering by Christ. We can take our suffering and the things that cause our suffering to the cross and be healed by him. I'm being a theologian here. So.
Well, I wonder, Susanna, if we reframed, here's a way of reframing the question. I want to know what you think about this, Derek. What if we didn't have not only our faith, but the whole reality that our faith is in? There was no Christ, there was no redemption. That point of reference didn't exist. What would we be left with? I mean, I suppose there could be moral heroes, but what does that add to, say, your ability to go and...
Well, it adds immensely, but I mean, that kind of counterfactual where if Christianity didn't exist, I mean, there are I've studied Buddhism for a long time, and there would still be Buddhists who I'm not a Buddhist, I disagree with the Buddhists, but I'm not so willing to say that it makes all the difference to me that God exists and that Christ has redeemed us, and 100%. And some of my own policy positions emerge from this conception that all, as Professor Crosby said, all persons have that value, and they can turn in a positive way. I wouldn't do what I do if I didn't believe that. So that directly comes from my Christian tradition. But I guess I'm reluctant to say that others in other traditions wouldn't do that. There's a lot of compassionate people in the world. So,
Did you want to add anything?
No, I'm edified by what I'm hearing from my colleagues and by the participants.
Well, we have maybe time for one more question, two more questions. One on this side, Charles, and then
Yeah, I wanted to clarify my point and integrate part of Susanna's, because I think part of the feeling of overwhelm and debt is the sense that even though our debt is never paid, that there's never a small payment we can make towards it that's acknowledged, which was what I was trying to say with the when I leave confession and I know that my Our Father is not enough for my sins, at least I can be a little bit assuaged that it's enough for this time. And I think, I don't know what that looks like in society because there's an aspect of confession that's private, so there's not a bunch of other people witnessing how much pain my sin has caused so that they can remind me that my debt isn't paid. And I think something that is really hard about these like public structures of sin is like how can we agree on what a small payment over a period of time is that seems fair, because obviously, just putting a little sign might not be enough to a community that a painting, caused a lot of oppression. Like they might be like, no, the whole painting has to be ripped down. And then someone's like, well, that's, is that too extreme for this moment in time? Which is where the calculus came in, because I'm like, there's something about the curve that keeps going. And I think some of these positions make it sound like the debt has to be paid all at once. But we don't treat anything else like that. When we buy a house, very few people buy a house outright. They agree on, a very small thing that can be paid. And I don't, how would we do that with penance if it's not private? Like, this is social. And we don't have people that, are as merciful as God is about the fact that our debts aren't paid instantly. And how can we as a society be more merciful towards each other without ignoring the suffering of each other either?
Yeah, once again, I would encourage you not to have the calculus thought, honestly, because you can't. There's too much going on there. And I think there's something theologically important because we're secondary causes and God is moving things in ways that are very difficult for us to understand. And the truth of the matter is in social and political life, sometimes you simply don't know. You just say, I'm opposed to torture and I'm going to, or abortion or something like that. I'm going to take, here I stand, and you're not quite sure of all of the effects, and that's not something you ought to try to calculate. The point of view, I think, of personalist movement is it tends to be anti-consequentialist, and I agree with that entirely.
But if I could also add to this, so a point that it touches on a number of things that people have said. Derek, you mentioned Joseph Seifert's work on human dignity.
That's right.
And he distinguishes this kind of dignity that he calls bestowed dignity.
That's right.
Right? So touching on some of the things that Maria was talking about earlier, right? When a parent says to the child, it is good that you exist, right? I rejoice that you exist. This bestows a kind of dignity on the child, right? Or even something as simple as, acknowledging that there are human beings suffering in prison.
That's right.
Right? It bestows a kind of dignity upon them. And if we can develop habits as a society of bestowing dignity on others, right? Hopefully explicitly in a face-to-face way, but even just in our thoughts, right? Thinking of people as dignified, right? This begins to move towards having a society in which we can extend this mercy towards each other.
Yeah, and Professor Seifert points out, you have conflicts between these kinds of dignities. They have to be properly ordered. Mm-hmm. And I don't bestow dignity on anybody in this room in terms of inherent dignity, but I bestow it in other forums. Right. And so you have to think about the orderings of the kinds of dignity. Once again, this is a big topic.
One answer that Pope John Paul might give, thinking back to this morning, is that the asking of forgiveness if there's wrong done, to acknowledge it, call it by its name, bring it before God, and ask the aggrieved person for forgiveness. That's what he did repeatedly in the run-up to the year 2000. And so that's not like returning a benefit, but trying to enter into the truth of the grievance.
Last question from Charles.
Just to return back, I'm wondering if is the structure of sin the same thing as a sinful structure?
What is the distinction you're making?
I'm wondering, because I think of persons as being sinful. They commit sin. There can be unjust structures that we participate in that are contrary to the ultimate will of God. So I'm just wondering if maybe some reactions against the idea of sinful structures, we might not say there might be evil structures and sinful persons. And I don't know if that has any illuminating power that might enable us to act more faithfully. But I've sometimes, I agree that there's structural, there are structures that are opposed to the will of God, or that fall short of the will of God, miss the mark of the will of God, that we need to attend to. I'm just not always so sure structures of sin or sinful structures is the best way. I'm just wondering if it might not be better to talk about the structures of evil, the instantiations of evil. And I think of like in Nazi Germany, anti-Semitism went beyond just individual attitudes or attitudinal and even behavioral, but there was something systemic that was evil.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think we're agreed on the principle and are just discussing the most prudent language, right, to talk about it. So, yeah, I guess I would have taken sinful structure of sin as equivalent, but perhaps you're suggesting we reserve the talk of sinful for persons, right, and not use it for structures. Yeah, there may be some merit in cleaning up our language that way. What do you think, Derek?
I do think that there might be some work to be done on these distinctions. Thomas Aquinas, in his great book De Malo, just tries to do some of these fine distinctions between that kind of sin and the absence of a good that should be present and that kind of work. So perhaps we could do that. Yeah. I don't see it as essential. I think Structures of Sin works pretty well, but right. I think Charles is raising a good question here about whether evil, we'd have to explore what that means. That's called De Malo, 500 pages of the great Thomas Aquinas, who tries to help us out there.
I've always found the phrase structure of sin helpful, in as much as not to deny that sin, properly speaking, is said of persons, but that the things that we do subjectively have an objective result, right? I bring about communities, I bring about relationships, I bring about artifacts by my subjective acts. And right, the German idealist tradition has this distinction between subjective spirit and objective spirit, that the structures of the mind and the heart are objectified out there in reality. And that seems to happen with our sins, right? They bring about these social situations that make it easier for persons to sin later on, or easier for injustices to be perpetuated later on.
That's a good point.
There are also good objective spirits. I wish we could have talked about some of those today. Maybe we will tomorrow. There's been a lot of negative stuff here, but I think there are systems of virtue as well. And maybe we can talk about those going forward. But at this point, let's thank our speakers.